All right, well, we're talking about the genesis of underground comics. And when you talk about the genesis of underground comics, you talk about two places. You have to talk about two places: San Francisco and Austin, Texas. Why, yes, the University of Texas at Austin will play a large role in the development of the underground comics scene. You see, in the early 60s, there were three individuals who were students at the University of Texas. Three individuals we'll be talking more about, one of whom we've mentioned already: Frank Stack, Gilbert Shelton, and Jack Jackson, usually known by his pen name Jackson with an X. Now, Frank Stack had actually graduated in 1959 and been away at the military for a couple of years, but during the time that Shelton and Jackson are there, Stack is once more becoming active in the undergrad humor magazine called Ranger, which had been around since the 1920s and would last into the late 1970s. So about half a century of this regular humor magazine put together by students. So Stack had been the editor in the late 50s, and then Gilbert Shelton took over as editor. Jackson was a frequent contributor. The cover we have right here on the left, that's from a 1951 issue, but the table of contents is from 1962, and you can see that both Shelton and Jackson are listed on there. Now, all three of them regularly contributed cartoons, comic strips, actually, to this humor magazine that was kind of modeled on, well, it preceded, but by this point was very much modeled on Mad Magazine. Frank Stack had a strip that started appearing in 1962. Now, remember, he'd already graduated, but his work is still appearing in the student magazine under the pseudonym Fulbert Sturgeon. He had a strip in there called The Adventures of Jesus. And a couple of years after these started appearing, Gilbert Shelton took all the different strips and kind of pasted them all together on pages, and then photocopied, xeroxed those pages. Not really photocopying, mimeographing. Xeroxed those pages, and he made 50 copies of The Adventures of Jesus, and basically passed them out, kind of a promotional thing to get people to follow the strip in the main magazine, Ranger. Passed them out to people on campus, so about 50 copies. Some people, some historians, point to this as the first underground comic, not counting the Tijuana Bibles. So it has all the elements. It's just kind of put together, do-it-yourself kind of thing. It's very anti-establishment, kind of poking fun at Jesus and simultaneously poking fun at university administrations. The only problem was that it wasn't initially sold. Now this cover here on the left, that's not from the original mimeographed copies that were passed out. That's from several years later when these were published by Ripoff Press. So some people say, well, they weren't actually sold. They were given away, so that doesn't count. That's promotional. Well, the same year that happened, Jack Jackson, alias Jackson with an X, who also had been doing a comic strip, in Ranger, his was called God Knows, collected several of his together and did the same thing. And in fact, he worked at a copy store, and so after hours he was like sneaking in there and running his own copies, and he made 1,000 copies of his collection of the God Knows strips, and sold them. So some people say, well, then this is the first underground comic. No matter which approach you take, whether you go with Frank Stack or you go with Jack Jackson, either way, the first underground comic was printed in Austin, Texas, and distributed at the University of Texas. And either way, Gilbert Shelton was involved for having been the editor of the magazine that originally published the strips. So all three of these guys are going to eventually become big parts of the overall underground comics movement. Shelton and Jackson will move out to San Francisco in 1968, 1969. Shelton, meanwhile, before that happened, after he graduates, winds up on staff at Help Magazine. That's where we mentioned him last time. Also on staff at Help Magazine had been Robert Crumb. And Crumb, in 1968, debuts the comic book Zap Comix with an X, published in San Francisco. And this is pointed to as the beginning of the underground comics movement, because it got a lot of exposure in San Francisco, more so than something published on the campus of the University of Texas had done. So it got a lot of exposure, plus times had changed. Countercultural revolution was a lot more in 1968 than it had been in 1964. So not only does he get the attention of readers and eventually even of marketers, right? Because it's his Keep On Truckin' comic strip first appeared in Zap Comix, and it winds up being marketed on merchandise, which he didn't get paid for. There were a lot of lawsuits involved there. But also a lot of other people saw this comic book, which was, again, sold on this underground means, not distributed by a regular publisher, and decided they could do the same thing. And so more and more people started doing that, and that was the beginning of the movement. 1968, the summer of 68, Zap came out in February, first issue. Summer of 68, Skip Williamson and his associates over in Chicago, who had been publishing a newspaper called Bijou, which occasionally ran comic strips, after having seen Zap Comix, decide they're going to do something similar. And so the summer of 1968 saw the debut of Bijou Funnies, which had a Robert Crumb story. Robert Crumb was one of the contributors to the first issue. Skip Williamson created the character Snappy Sammy Smoot, who first appeared in that first issue of Bijou Funnies and would appear in that book thereafter, and would throughout the underground comics movement, Williamson would occasionally contribute to other people's books and bring Snappy Sammy with him when he did. Well, I mentioned Shelton and Jackson making their way out with a couple of their friends from Austin, making their way out to San Francisco to become a part of the hippie scene. And it is there that they establish Rip-Off Press, which initially published their work, but within a short time was publishing work from other people. In fact, I think it was Rip-Off Press who did both that collection of the Adventures of Jesus and the collection of Snappy Sammy Smoot stories, all put together. That was in the previous slide. So Shelton's titles included Wonder Warthog, The Hog of Steel, and what's probably the second most closely associated thing, maybe third most, I guess you could say Robert Crumb and Trina Robbins were the biggest names, but also one of the things that is kind of emblematic of the whole underground comics scene was Gilbert Shelton's title, The Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, which ran for quite a while and was about three guys constantly in search of weed. It was kind of like a comic book version of the Cheech and Chong comedy duo that were also becoming extremely popular at around this time. So the stories of the Freak Brothers, like I said, it's kind of centered on their endless search for a better high. Meanwhile, on the East Coast in Greenwich Village, which traditionally has been one of the happening countercultural places in New York City, there was a newspaper that was established, an underground newspaper established in 1965 called the East Village Other. And they included comic strips in the paper from local artists, one of whom was named Manuel Rodriguez, but he went by the pseudonym Spain. And he created a character in 1968 called Trash Man. His style was heavily influenced by Wally Wood, by the way. So Trash Man appeared in the newspaper, and not long afterward, after a few strips had appeared, they were all collected together in an anthology newspaper collection of The Collected Trash Man there on the left. And also, that was in 1968. Also in 68, 69, the East Village Other started publishing Zodiac Mind Warp, which was a newspaper. It was a tabloid, but it was all underground comics, all local artists. Well, not all local artists. I think Robert Crumb wound up also contributing some stuff there. 1970 saw the first work made by underground artist Art Spiegelman, The Complete Mr. Infinity. Actually, it had been a series of strips which, kind of like with the Adventures of Jesus, were collected together. And in fact, they're collected in the same format as a Tijuana Bible, right? So each page is one strip, and then they're all stapled together. Art Spiegelman would be another of the luminaries of the underground comics movement. He did a lot of different stuff, but he's best known for Mouse, which was a story about his relationship with his father and about his parents' experiences in the Holocaust, in which all the Jewish characters were portrayed as mice and the Nazis were cats. This actually was first published in serialized form in comic books in the 1980s. But when it was collected together into one volume as a graphic novel, Spiegelman won the Pulitzer Prize. So this vaulted him into the ether, as it were, with his work frequently being assigned in college classes, and students continually, one generation of students after another, experiencing just how powerful comics can be, and graphic novels, and in this case, a graphic novel from a comic by an underground comics legend. All right, well, we have talked about Trina Robbins several times. The fact that she was involved there in the ground floor of It Ain't Me, Babe, the women's liberation all-woman artist and writer collection, one shot, and the underground comic title Women's Comics, in the first issue of which Trina Robbins did a story called Sandy Comes Out, right? So we talked about all that and about how influential Trina Robbins has been. I don't think that I've remembered to mention, though, that in the 1960s, just like Gilbert Shelton and Robert Crumb, Trina Robbins got her start working at Warren magazines. And in fact, 1969, Trina Robbins had co-created Vampirella along with J. Forrest Ackerman, all the covers of which were painted by Frank Frazetta. So Trina Robbins, that's definitely a name you should remember long after this class is over. Well, 1972 saw Robert Crumb and Underground Comix get really a lot of exposure, pun intended, when one of his characters, Fritz the cat, became the star of an animated film by Ralph Bakshi. Okay, now this is significant because it was the very first X-rated animated film, and it's not just one big long piece of pornography. It has a storyline, very serious storyline, really, but there's a lot of cat nudity and a lot of cat sex going on, and this, like you would expect, got a lot of media attention, but apparently not enough because when I was little, we lived right next door to the movie theater in our town of Sparta, Tennessee. And I had two uncles, two of my mom's brothers, worked at the theater. One of them was the usher, and the other one was the projectionist. So I practically lived at the movie theater, especially if there was, cartoons on, right? So my mom just sent me over there, and, they just let me in. And so my mom thought this was just, your typical cartoon, like a Disney thing. And so sent me in there to watch Fritz the cat when I was 5 years old. And that may explain a lot of things about my life since. All right, now let's talk finally about Justin Green. Justin Green, who in 1972 produced Binky Brown Meets the Holy Virgin Mary, which was a self-contained story, a 44-page single-story underground comic that was autobiographical. It was a memoir. It was about Green's struggles with his various neuroses and his obsessive-compulsive disorder and his sexual obsessions, from Last Gasp Press. Now, already, and I mentioned this earlier, a lot of these underground comics, most of them initially, were anthology comics, just like the early regular comic books were anthology things. So there had already started to be small stories, short stories within those anthology comics that were sort of mini memoirs. But this is the first one that takes up an entire volume and is self-contained. So in a way that makes this one more step toward the modern graphic novel. All right, well, underground comics movement started with a specific thing. February 1968, the publication of the first issue of Zap Comics. It ends kind of with a specific thing, 1975 or so, when President Nixon he kills underground comics, not intentionally. That's not who he was aiming at. But the underground comic scene became collateral damage, unexpected casualties, not that Nixon cared, of the war on drugs. Okay? Look it up. The war on drugs started under Nixon, and we now know We now know because of declassified documents that the intention behind the war on drugs, which, by the way, you can win a war declared against another country. It's hard to win a war against a noun. But the intention, we now know, was to give the FBI and other law enforcement agencies a justification to target hippies, radicals, and African Americans under the subterfuge of clamping down on marijuana. Well, by clamping down on marijuana, one of the ways that was done is that drug paraphernalia was outlawed. The sort of natural result of that is that all those head shops that we talked about started going out of business because it's where you went to buy papers to roll marijuana and pipes to smoke marijuana and bongs for marijuana. And that was where most of these underground comics were sold. And so the only real venue they had, they were all going out of business. And that left the only thing that they had available to them, mail order. So they already had been doing a mail order business. I mean, if you lived in, like in Sparta, Tennessee, if you were older than 4 years old, but you could get a subscription to some of these magazines you'd heard about that you didn't have access to buy. But not many people did that. And when that became the only way they could sell the underground comics, they started going out of business. And that was the end of that movement. Now, it was the end of that movement, but sort of the natural consequence of that was the beginning of another movement. The other movement being independent comics, which we're going to now be getting into in great deal in just a little bit. But first, we got to have the last gasps of the underground comics movement. And that came, well, one of the last gasps was when Marvel got involved. Stan Lee, long in the habit of picking up on whatever the new trend was, right? That's what comics did. And now underground comics are the thing in the early 70s. So 1974, Marvel decides to get in on the action, not knowing the action is all about to collapse. Plus, the way they did it really did not seem like it had a lot of potential to succeed. Essentially, Stan Lee contacted Dennis Kitchen, who was an underground comics artist who had started his own press, Kitchen Sink Press, and tried to encourage him to edit an underground comics comic from the very much above ground Marvel comics, which again seemed like an oxymoron, really. However, they were promised, Kitchen was promised, that there would be like a total creative freedom, although within limits, because this stuff has to be sold, in grocery stores, not grocery stores, but like, magazine racks at places like Kroger's, Schnucks, the larger grocery store chains. So they couldn't get too overboard with the nudity and sex and stuff, but within limits. And they were even promised that this magazine would have no ads. Now, why does that matter? Because these underground artists don't want to compromise. They don't want to sell out. That's why they're underground artists for the most part. Most of them had plenty enough talent that they could have been working in venues that paid much better. So no commercials, so they would not be beholden to any businesses, any sponsors. And so they gave it a go. Here, Dennis Kitchen, this is kind of funny. He portrays Stan Lee in the story of how the magazine starts. he draws him as a J. Jonah Jameson, Peter Parker's constantly cranky, irate publisher. Anyway, now they had people contributing to this book like Trina Robbins was a contributor. Many of the other people that we've talked about, Skip Williamson was a contributor. Art Spiegelman was a contributor. In fact, in one issue, he had the prototype, a few pages of what would become Mouse that appeared in this title, Comix book. Unfortunately, by the time issue 3 came out, the sales results from issue 1 were available, and there weren't any, hardly. People that shopped at Kroger's and Schnucks and were looking through the magazines at the Sports Illustrated and Mechanics Illustrated and so forth didn't know what to make of this. And also there was already some concern among the contributors because Marvel was insisting that they owned the content of whatever appeared. They might not own the characters, but they owned the stories and the content. And that's not how underground comics artists worked. They frequently contributed their own characters and stories back and forth, right, to one another's books. So with issue 3, it was canceled. Kitchen decided that since it's canceled after issue 3, but issue 4 and issue 5 were both ready to be published. They had all the stories together. He wanted to go ahead and publish them under his own publishing company of Kitchen Sink, but it took a year or two to get through all the legal entanglements to finally get permission to use the material. So this was an experiment that failed, and it was kind of doomed to failure on several levels. Number one, because they're jumping on board something that's already about to die, and number two, they're trying to mainstream something whose very existence is predicated on its non-mainstreamness, essentially. So, didn't work out. Now, in a way, by this time, Marvel had kind of an underground comics character anyway, something very, very similar to the sensibility and style of underground comics, and that was the character of Howard the Duck, which was not underground because it was through Marvel, created by Steve Gerber and the artist Val Mayerick. Steve Gerber had he was not your run-of-the-mill superhero comics writer. He did some very surreal things, not the least of which was the creation of Howard the Duck, who first appeared in an issue of Man-Thing, and then in 1976 finally got his own book. Howard the Duck is a duck named Howard from a planet where ducks have evolved into being the intelligent beings, and humans are just sort of like dumb animals. And there's a shift in the cosmic axis, right, the fabric of space and time, and Howard, who is a cab driver on Duckworld, gets deposited on Earth among all these humans. So the tagline is, he is trapped in a world he never made. Now, he's interacting with Spider-Man and the Defenders and so forth, but he is very much a humorous character, but a darkly humorous and a very satiric character. This is not, like your typical cartoon duck. This is not Donald Duck transposed into the Marvel Universe. Howard the Duck has very adult themes, even in the four-color comics. Then later, 1978-79, Howard the Duck got his own black and white magazine, comic magazine, which meant that, they could go a lot further with with profanity and nudity and drug references and stuff. So it became even more adult. And he was constantly in a state of existential crisis. He was very neurotic. He had a lot of self-doubts. He was a freaky character, and he caught on. It was the 1970s, man. That's just the kind of stuff that resonated with readers, even teenage readers and older especially. You can tell a lot about Howard the Duck by who his enemies were. His recurring enemies included the Space Turnip, Bessie the Hell Cow, who was a cow that was bitten by Dracula. Dracula was like really needing a hit of some blood, and he couldn't find any human victims, so in desperation, he temporarily satiated himself by biting a cow, who then becomes an insidious vampire. But my favorite was Dr. Bong, which they got away with, in part because the censors may not have even known what a bong was. But yeah, his helmet there is a bell, and he makes this bell sound, so that's what bong means. All right, well, I said that this book became very popular. The character became very popular. The back issue value of the early issues of Howard the Duck just went through the roof. I mean, something that sold originally for 25 cents was going for $25 and more in no time, because it became such a popular character because he was so quirky, you know. And I remember when I was in high school, because I hadn't gotten the first few issues when they came out, and I saved up my money and I did some trading and stuff, and I bet I shelled out $100 in trade value to get the first 2 or 3 issues of Howard the Duck. And then this movie came out, 1986, directed and produced by George Lucas, which is usually included in discussions of the worst movies of all time. It was horrible. The animatronic duck, who looked nothing like Howard the Duck, was horrible. The acting was horrible. The writing was horrible. The directing was horrible. It was just horrible. And it totally destroyed the value of Howard the Duck. Those comic books were back to being worth a quarter after this movie came out. It was very frustrating. I much prefer Howard the Duck as he has appeared in the Guardians of the Galaxy movies in more recent years. Now, you may have noticed something. We've transitioned from talking about underground comics to being back at Marvel, talking about mainstream Marvel comics, although Howard the Duck is like at the weirdest edge of mainstream. That is a sure sign that we have reached the point where the underground comics movement ended. But like I said, that movement led into another very important movement.